everybody. As I promised in the title, I'm going to talk about a recent New Yorker article from Jonathan Franzen and respond to it. But I wanted to kind of start, the article's about a lot of things, but part of what it's about is the question of hope or emotions, how we feel about our own actions, the climate, the future. So I wanted to get a sense just from you, and I know many of you have been studying these things already for a few weeks, so you've maybe been thinking quite intensely, and some of you may just be everyday citizens who've been thinking about this. What kind of words come to mind when you think of your feelings about the climate future? Like how would you describe your sense? Is it hope? Is it something else? Yeah. Fear. Yeah. I've seen some nodding from other people. Yeah.
Also confused.
Confused. What else? Any others? Fear, confusion. Yeah.
Frustration and anger.
Frustration and anger. Lots of affects when I think of the same. Yeah.
Opportunity.
Opportunity. There we go. A little some glowing. Yeah.
I'm going to bring it back a little here.
Sure.
Despair, because there are people I care about that will be underwater soon.
Yeah, despair, and that's really powerful. A lot of these words you can see kind of linked to grief, to uncertainty. A lot of words that we know, including opportunity, that can really motivate people politically, but can also shut down kind of possibilities politically. I'm sure many of you have other words in your head. And I wanted to start with that because I think that Jonathan Franzen's piece is partially about trying to orient us towards certain types of feelings, certain ways of kind of approaching the world. And I want to talk about the ways he offers and why I think they might be insufficient, and then offer a figure from another thinker who I think might offer, if not hope, at least another way of thinking about possibilities, despite or maybe kind of an embrace of all of these difficult affects that we struggle with. So I don't know if anyone read the Franzen piece recently. I'll give a little summary of it, but you could read the whole thing. I may, in case I'm not fair to him. I have all kinds of rants I could do about his fiction that maybe would take up all my whole 15 minutes, so I won't do that. I thought I could just reread the terrible sex scenes in Purity over and over until you all cried out. It'd be like sort of a Orwellian 2-minute hate, but I won't. But just know that Jonathan Franzen is a really prominent literary fiction writer. He had a book called The Corrections now, I guess almost 20 years ago, that won a bunch of prizes. He tends to be sort of seen as one of the leading literary writers of his generation, but is also very controversial, particularly for how he writes women, for how his books embody a particular type of maybe whiteness, which some have said he's a useful guide to in that way. And so he publishes this article now on September 8th, so just over a week ago. And the article in the New Yorker is called, I'm going to get the title right, is called What If We Stopped Pretending? And it's illustrated by this amazing image of a mom pushing, I assume it's a mom, I guess, pushing a child on a tire swing while the forest around them burns. You can probably guess what the argument is just from this kind of title, right? I'm going to tell you about what he says and how I would respond, and I'll try to at least do a good job, but please read it if you want to get kind of a better sense of it. So he starts from the point that I think a lot of you are already starting from the comments you said about your emotions. He says that we are facing the, quote, radical destabilization of life on Earth. And then he says that hope is fundamentally the wrong affective response to that. He calls it unrealistic. He points out the way in which we've known about this problem for at least 30 years and have failed to take collective action, I think for some of the reasons that Professor Austin identified earlier. And he suggests that responding to the immensity of this problem, or our historical failure, with hope is fundamentally promising a type of salvation that's not possible and maybe blunting our capacities to work otherwise on climate change. He points out that we would probably need, quote, top-down intervention in and throughout every country to make climate change reasonably prevented or stopped. And that would mean that all people would need to sacrifice for, quote, distant threatened nations and distant future generations. And he claims, and he doesn't offer evidence for this, that climate activists are unwilling to accept this reality because they're afraid it will scare people off from working on environmental challenges. And so what he argues is that we should spend our resources, our limited resources that we have as individuals, by focusing on local or manageable environmental problems, focusing on relationships or entities that we love. So he gives the example of a CSA in the town he lives in, which is Santa Cruz, which employs homeless individuals. He talks about, the strawberries and kale that he gets from it. And this for him is kind of a model of what we should focus on. So kind of focus on the local, accept that you can't have hope on the global scale. And there's a lot of responses to him that I think from scientists who point out that the way in which, so his article seems to suggest that because it's unlikely that we're going to avoid the 2 degree raise in global temperatures, that we're going to hit that tipping point and therefore it's all over. There's a lot of scientists who responded with a lot more detail than I could muster as a non-scientist about why thinking about that tipping point as all or nothing is a problem. It's very important, but how many degrees you go over 2 degrees really matters, right? How quickly you go past that really matters. In what fashion you go past that really matters. And I think from my perspective, I think the way in which you confront the challenges of inequality matters as we face climate change. So if I have a thesis, it's that climate change offers up the opportunity, whether or not it offers up the opportunity to completely avert all the catastrophes that are possible, it offers us the opportunity to make the world either more or less equal, to either double down on the inequality that we have, or to lessen that inequality. And I mean the inequality between human groups, but also the inequality between humans and other types of beings and their demands on us and our obligations to them as members of a broader Earth community. And so that's why I think Franzen's argument is a little problematic. The first thing, so he talks a lot in this piece about how human nature, he says, and I feel like whenever you're talking about ecology, you should pay attention when people motivate their arguments with claims about human nature, that human nature is too limited, our psychology is too prone to denial. We'd rather think about our breakfast than death every day. Which I guess is true, right? You sit down at the breakfast table. It's hard to think about death first thing. And he says, our human psychology suggests that we're not going to be willing to sacrifice for people in distant countries, as he said. Someone brought up the idea that people they care about are potentially, maybe even right now, underwater. But Franzen points to the ways in which many climate disasters seem to happen at some remove for many of us. At least if we're like Jonathan Franzen, and maybe the reading community that he's speaking to, relatively isolated from this sort of issues. But I don't know that he really provides good evidence that humans are not willing to make sacrifices for people distant from them, either, first of all, through the kind of synecdoche of caring deeply about people who are close to them, and then therefore extending that concern to similar people in other countries and other places. Humans have been willing to make great sacrifices for the nation state, for nationalism, which itself is a constructed and transient invention. We didn't always have the nation state. Humans have been able to make great sacrifices for non-human beings when they conceive of them as having some measure of equality or place in the world. And I don't think there's really a reason to think that's not possible again. I think one way to think about this is to think about the way in which similar arguments were motivated against abolishing chattel slavery. Similar arguments were motivated against Indian colonialism, that human nature is not going to allow. And if you'll notice in those arguments, part of the argument is about capitalism, that capitalism can't work without enslaved labor, free labor. Capitalism can't work without exploitation. But there's also an implied hierarchy of different types of human beings in colonialism and capitalism. And in the argument about climate change, that same kind of logic is deployed, partially about measuring different lives differently. So valuing the people's lives that we assume are going to be harmed first by climate change, maybe in developing countries or maybe in, on the coast, people who don't have the resources necessarily to move to New Zealand and live off the blood of young people. And so undoing those logics or questioning those logics that allowed slavery and colonialism to happen, but then also to be overturned, is part of kind of the work of climate change and climate change activists. And I think Franzen is kind of suggesting that we have to accept the logic that undergirded those systems, and that we have to accept their inevitability, because this is some sort of human nature rather than kind of a particular historical moment. And he's not interested in the other way, that people have motivated to overcome great odds. I think to us now, the idea of slavery being ended in the United States and elsewhere seems like inevitable. But it was another system that people said it would be impossible to change. It would destroy capitalism if we got rid of this. Capitalism can't work without colonial extraction of resources from distant places. And second, I think this is really linked to this. I think it's really important to attend to the way in which his argument is presuming a particular type of we. And maybe this is unfair, although probably not. You know, the New Yorker is a pretty prominent magazine. But he's acting as if, you know, most people are sitting at their breakfast table not thinking about death or climate change. And the most people he's talking about are people like me and maybe like you, who are relatively well off and are able to not think about the challenges of climate change every day. And this is not true for people all over the world, but also for all sorts of people in the United States, right? You may have friends or relatives in Houston right now who are underwater, or people who fled fires or hurricanes or all the other things, people who have families who are climate migrants. And so the kind of the assumption that there's this common we that's more interested in denial, I think, really betrays the kind of limits of his imagination about this issue. And he could again find a lot of resources for thinking in a broader way about the we through anti-racist work, through anti-colonial work, through ecologists who challenge the limits of who we kind of count as members of our community, who all would stretch or push you to stretch, like who fits into the we, and who kind of who we should be thinking about centering in our talk about climate change. But the last thing I think I would want to say to Franzen is I think in a certain extent his focus on hope is a little bit odd. I understand we all need things that motivate us, that move us forward, but hope is not the only emotion available to us. And some of you talked about being angry and frustrated. You know, maybe this is part of my personality, and I should say I'm somebody who's pretty fascinated by climate pessimism. I taught a class called The End where we read there's a bunch of people who take climate pessimism much further than Franzen that he really should have cited or read, who use it to really challenge us to think about what would happen if we imagined a world without humans. How would we change our ways of thinking about knowledge and art and culture if we really imagined that future? What would it really mean to think about apocalypse in this way, in a full sense? And how would this shift our everyday kind of attachment? So he should read them. I'm sympathetic to pessimism. I'm prone to negative affects, but I've learned to kind of embrace that, and I think Franzen should too. I think he should take his impulse. I think he comes from a place that many of us have come from, of feeling frustrated, grieving. You know, I was listening yesterday to the story about, you know, the 3 billion birds that we've lost since 1970, and it was like gutting me. Like, I was feeling really choked up. I was like, oh, maybe I shouldn't reference this here because I'm going to tear up on camera. It's going to be terrible. Like, climate grief is a real thing, processing that, figuring out what to do with it. But I think we have options rather than folding into our own little communities, which are, again, going to enhance the inequalities that already exist. If we invest in the communities we already love and we're already part of, we're going to enhance the inequalities that already exist rather than fight them through the way that we attack climate change. And so I want to bring up a alternative figure rather than the climate pessimist who might be helpful, who is the killjoy. And so I'm going to read a piece. These are a bunch of quotes from a Sarah Ahmed piece. She's a queer phenomenologist in Great Britain. I'm excerpting, so some of the argument's going to be missed, but I want you to listen and think about, she's talking about the killjoy in the context of gender and sexuality, but I want you to try to think about this figure in relation to the climate, and then I'll talk a little bit about it and how it might be useful to us. So she's starting with telling a story kind of about how she became a feminist. So she says, "We began with a table. Around this table, the family gathers, having polite conversations, where only certain things can be brought up. Someone says something you consider problematic. You are becoming tense. It is becoming tense. How hard to tell the difference between what is you and what is it. You respond carefully, perhaps. You say why you think what they have said is problematic. You might be speaking quietly, but you're beginning to feel wound up, recognizing with frustration that you are being wound up by someone who is winding you up. In speaking up or speaking out, you upset the situation. That you have described what was said by another as a problem means you have created a problem. You become the problem you create. To be the object of shared disapproval, those glances that can cut you up, cut you out, an experience of alienation can shatter a world. The family gathers around the table. They are supposed to be happy occasions. How hard we work to keep the occasion happy, to keep the surface of the table polished so that it can reflect back a good image of the family. So much you are not supposed to say, to do, to be, in order to preserve that image. If you say or do or be anything that does not reflect the image of the happy family back to itself, the world becomes distorted. You become the cause of a distortion. You are the distortion you cause. Another Denner ruined. To become alienated from a picture can allow you to see what the picture does not and will not reflect. Becoming a feminist or a climate activist can be an alienation from happiness, though not just that, not only that. Oh, the joy of being able to leave the place you were given. When we feel happiness in proximity to the right objects, we are aligned. We are facing the right way. You become alienated, out of line with an affective community, when you do not experience happiness from the right things. The gap between the affective value of an object and how we experience an object can involve a range of affects, which are directed by the modes of explanation we offer to fill this gap. And I hope some of you have had the experience that I've had, which is maybe particular to my family, of being home for Thanksgiving and trying to have a conversation, and then something comes up that you can't let go, and you have to halt the proceedings. You don't mean to, but you just can't let it go, and then you fight with your dad and ruin Thanksgiving for everybody. That's this kind of killjoy figure. And she goes on to give a lot of details about the killjoy, and she says, the figure of the feminist killjoy makes sense if we place her in the context of feminist critiques of happiness, of how happiness is used to justify social norms as social goods. And she talks about the way in which one feminist project could be to give the killjoy back her voice, hearing what people are saying who seem to be killing our kind of collective joy. And so she ends this essay by saying, let's take the figure of the feminist killjoy seriously. Does she expose the bad feelings that get hidden, displaced, or negated under public signs of joy? Does bad feeling enter the room when somebody expresses anger about things, maybe climate change? Or could anger be the moment when the bad feelings that circulate through objects get brought on the surface in a certain way? The feminist subject in the room brings down others, not only by talking about unhappy topics, such as sexism, but by exposing how happiness is sustained by erasing the signs of not getting along. Feminists do kill joy in a certain sense. They disturb the very fantasy that happiness can be found in certain places. To kill a fantasy can still kill a feeling. It is not just that feminists might not be happily affected by what is supposed to cause happiness, but our failure to be happy is read as sabotaging the happiness of others. And then she ends by saying, she's not evoking the feminist killjoy to say that our job is to be kind of dour sad sacks, which one could maybe accuse Franzen of being, but that instead these moments that point out the gap sometimes between us and other collectivities that we're supposed to be part of, ways that we're supposed to feel happy, things that we're supposed to want. If you think about some of the currents that other speakers were talking about in terms of relationships between the logics of capitalist accumulation and consumption and acquisition and extraction, things that you're supposed to want. If there's a gap between what you want and that, it opens up the space, and in that space, she wants us to create collective projects of addressing those wrongs, build what she calls feminist tables, become feminist killjoys together. And so she's actually going to talk in this, I won't read it because I know I'm at the end of my time, but she talks about the ways in which strikes are a way of enacting killjoy politics, people putting their bodies and their labor in the way of the regular actions of politics. I think Greta Thunberg is a great image for the feminist killjoy, not only because she doesn't smile very much, she points to the way in which our collective models of happiness are not serving us. So I would say back to Franzen to end, to think first harder about inequality and what his argument means for actual existing people, maybe not New Yorker readers, but then also to take those instincts he has, those emotions, those feelings of fear and anger and grief, and see them as, instead of the stopping point, as the starting point that rather than denying them or pushing them down or rejecting them or telling ourselves we just have to be happy, to instead think about what collectivities you could build around those killjoy moments and the feelings of alienation from maybe what people at your breakfast table or not want you to do. So hope is not lost for Franzen or us, but the feelings of anger and sadness and grief can be a starting point to build community around rather than an end point that leads us to give up and just tend our own private garden or CSA. So thanks.